I wanted to come to the floor to discuss a recent op-ed in the New York Times just a few days ago. It kind of made a stir. A lot of people thought it was a really good op-ed. I didn't. And I wanted to come to the floor and talk about this op-ed because it is making the rounds. And it's by the columnist Thomas Friedman. And it's on national security, economic security, trade issues relating to China. Now, Mr. President, I normally enjoy, respect, don't always agree with the seriousness of Mr. Friedman's writing. He's written a lot of books, a lot of columns, especially on the Middle East, where he has a lot of insights, no doubt about it. But, Mr. President, when I read this latest column, it was called "I Just Saw the Future," it was not in America. I couldn't believe how shockingly naive Mr. Friedman was in writing this. And so I just wrote a response. Just started writing after reading this saying, my goodness, this is very naive. And then I submitted that to the New York Times. They said, hey, sorry, it's too long. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe they didn't think it was that good. So I just said, well, you know, I can just read it on the Senate floor. Because I think this is a big debate, our relationship with China, how we view it, how he views it, how others view it, how President Trump views it, and it needs to be debated. So that's what I want to do for the next couple minutes, Mr. President, just talk about the Friedman piece and my view on why it is so naive and misses so many things, and particularly gives Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party a giant pass in terms of their history and what they've done to the international trading system. But first, Mr. President, the Friedman article kind of condescendingly mocks, to be honest, a lot of us, right? Quotes some senators, U.S. senators, and says, you know, these senators need to get out more when it comes to China. That's a quote in the article. Well, Mr. President, in my career, I've actually gotten out to China a lot. I mean, in terms of working on the Chinese issues, I served on the National Security Council staff under Condoleezza Rice when she was the National Security Advisor, later served as her Assistant Secretary of State in charge of economics, trade, energy, finance. Again, under Secretary Rice, I was the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in Alaska, went to China then. In all these positions, I met with Chinese leaders, traveled to China a fair amount. And of course, Mr. President, China national security issues for my really bookended my entire 30-year Marine Corps career. My first deployment in the Marines was to the Taiwan Strait during what's now referred to as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis in 1995 and 96. My last billet in the Marine Corps as Chief of Staff to the Marine Forces Pacific Commander at Indo-PACOM, where it's all about China and Taiwan. So, as a senator, I've continued to focus on these issues, traveling to Asia frequently. And the lessons I've learned, Mr. President, when it comes to China are very different from those in the Thomas Friedman piece. As someone who's actually gotten out a fair amount to China, as Mr. Friedman tells us senators that we need to do. So let's go into some of these lessons. Because for a smart guy, they sure were kind of naive to me. So first, Mr. President, Thomas Friedman talks about the need for an agreement between the United States and China, but the big worry is, quote, that President Trump would not stick by any agreement with China. That's what he says. Now, he says this without even hinting at one of the Chinese Communist leadership's most consistent, salient, and frustrating traits. And this is it. They, the Chinese Communist leadership, almost never abide by their agreements with the United States. And I mean never. Big agreements, small agreements, it doesn't matter. They never abide by their agreements. I've seen this throughout my career, Mr. President. In 2003, I was actually in this meeting right there. That's President George W. Bush and the Vice Premier of China, Madame Wu Yi, in the Oval Office. I was a young staffer right there next to the president, and President Bush pressed her, Madame Wu Yi, on this theft of intellectual property that China does. Pressed her hard. Madame Wu Yi, you have to stop stealing our IPR. That senior Chinese official, 2003, looked at the President of the United States and solemnly and sincerely said, Mr. President, we will stop this. You have my word. Well, Mr. President, we all know what happened. For decades, they've lied about that. The last report USTR did on China's theft of intellectual property rights from the United States, $600 billion a year. Madame Wu Yi lied to President Bush in the Oval Office. No doubt about that. Mr. President, I was also part of Secretary Rice's senior leadership at the State Department, taking part in the twice-yearly cabinet-level meetings launched by President Bush and China's President Hu Jintao called the Strategic Economic Dialogue, the SED it was called. So that's more Bush, China. They never kept any of their SED commitments, ever. I saw this. And Mr. President, this is what I refer to as promise fatigue. Promise fatigue. The United States makes an agreement with China, and they never keep it. Never keep it. Now, you know who's made an art form out of promise fatigue and not keeping their promises? This guy, Xi Jinping. Remember this one, Mr. President? In the Rose Garden with President Obama, President Xi Jinping and President Obama in the Rose Garden in 2015. President Xi Jinping looked at Barack Obama, looked at the American people and said, we are not going to do any more cyber theft, and we are not going to militarize the islands of the South China Sea. That's what Xi Jinping told President Obama. Guess what? That was a huge lie. They were already doing it. Remember these, Mr. President? President Trump and then President Biden. Xi Jinping made commitments to both President Trump and President Biden. We're going to stop the importation of fentanyl into Mexico and the United States. Xi Jinping said that to President Trump and President Biden. Guess what? Never kept that agreement, ever. And of course, during the Trump administration, first term, the Phase 1 China deal, signed with all this fanfare in the East Room of the White House. I was actually there, Mr. President, when that happened. And they never kept any of those commitments. So no matter what, when it comes to China, they just don't keep their word. They don't keep their word. And yet, Tom Friedman's article focuses on President Trump's reliability. As Joe Biden would say, come on, man. These are the guys who cheat and aren't reliable at all, and we all know it. Second, Mr. President, Friedman highlights what he sees as a great opportunity with China as it relates to our economic relations. And yet, he never mentions the overriding goal of this guy, Xi Jinping. What is that overriding goal? He never mentions it once. That's to make sure the Chinese Communist Party stays in power and expands its power base at home and abroad through any means necessary, including coercion and violence. This is the goal that we all know drives his decision-making. Like many in the Senate, Mr. President, I frequently attend classified briefings on China. We just had the Indo-PACOM commander testifying today, Admiral Paparo, who, by the way, is doing a great job. Make no mistake, it's in all the intel briefings, this guy, Xi Jinping, is preparing for war in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, heck, look in there. He's in his fatigues. And his aggressive efforts might extend beyond that. What am I talking about, Mr. President? The Chinese military just completed another massive military exercise to not only blockade Taiwan, but to stop any reinforcements coming to Taiwan. And then they conducted offensive military exercises off the shore of our allies, the Philippines and Australia. Their Navy went all the way around Australia just a couple of weeks ago. Yet Friedman naively references Chinese Communist Party talking points, healthy interdependencies, quote, quote, win-win. These guys always use that, win-win, and will rise together. And yet he ignores the military menace of the CCP abroad and its genocidal tendencies at home. But hey, that's okay. Mr. Friedman says, hey, there's a lot of smart people in China who can help us with AI. Sorry, I'm a little bit more worried about that. And then he notes, quote, Beijing does not want a trade war. No, in fact, they're actually preparing for a real war. And that is a fact for anyone who knows about China. Finally, Mr. President, the entire thrust of Friedman's piece builds on and reinforces one of the biggest strategic blunders that the United States has made with regard to China in our China strategy over the past 4 decades, and that is outsourcing much of our national security to corporate America. Friedman argues that we should concentrate on letting both of our private sectors in China and the United States work together. And if we do that, Americans working in partnership, this is Tom Friedman's words, with benevolent Chinese capital and technology will prosper just like the Chinese benefited from American capital and technology in the last 4 decades. And Tom Friedman has the nerve to call President Trump's thinking, quote, magical. Well, this is really magical from Tom Friedman. First off, the Chinese communist system doesn't really have a private sector. Again, anyone who gets out to China knows this. Everybody in China ultimately works for the CCP, for Xi Jinping, for the Chinese Communist Party. And Mr. President, just as importantly as we have so painfully learned over the past 4 decades, the U.S. private sector, especially Wall Street and some of the big corporate CEOs, are very poor guardians of America's national security and economic interests when it comes to China. The U.S. government finally, starting during President Trump's first term, started to say, whoa, wait, stop. We can't outsource our national security to corporate America. We, the U.S. government, need to safeguard our own interests. And that's what we're trying to do. I will say, Mr. President, we just saw it a couple years ago, the annual American CEO Confab in Beijing with Xi Jinping in the People's Hall, which in my view has become a national embarrassment, with Xi triumphantly leading the sycophantic-looking American CEOs behind him, does nothing to dispel the concern that this remains a strategic weakness in our national security relative to China. As we speak, Mr. President, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, propaganda is flooding the world to fan the flames of a narrative that Friedman seems to embrace. And it's this. Their narrative is President Trump has broken the World War II liberal international trading system. And this charge, Mr. President, is ridiculous. And it gives a pass to the real culprit. The Chinese Communist Party broke the system a long time ago, and that has been their intention all along. In 2005, then Deputy Secretary of State, future World Bank President Bob Zoellick, delivered his well-received speech called the Responsible Stakeholder Speech. It noted that more than any other country, China has benefited from the international economic order set up by the United States after World War II, and it was now time for China to safeguard and embrace and become a responsible stakeholder in this system to help it endure. I was in meetings with senior Chinese officials not long after this speech, and they deceivingly used the term responsible stakeholder, much to the American policymakers' delight. But, Mr. President, these CCP leaders clearly had other plans: to unleash policies that continued their rampant intellectual property theft of American businesses, to never keep their promise and commitments they make to Americans, forcing U.S. companies to hand over proprietary technology in order to gain access to China's market, aggressively subsidizing important industries like steel, where they flooded global markets and destroyed the American heartland, blocking U.S. exports from having fair and reciprocal access to China's market, and unleashing economic coercion on our allies like Australia, Korea, and Japan when they dared to question CCP orthodoxy. The Trump administration policies are a course correction to all of this. But make no mistake, Mr. President, it was the Chinese Communist Party and its policies that took a wrecking ball to the international trading system, and yet, like so many other aspects of Friedman's piece, he gives the CCP and Xi a pass on this most consequential point. U.S. senators on both sides of the aisle, including those who don't even get out much, according to Mr. Friedman, have recognized this truth. It would be good progress if an insightful observer of the international system, like Thomas Friedman is, would do so as well. I yield the floor.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I was sitting with the CEO of one of America's biggest and most influential companies last month, and I asked him a simple question. What could President Trump do that would be a bridge too far for you? What attack on democracy or the rule of law could Trump make that would cause you to speak up? His answer was pretty simple, and it was pretty confident. He said that if Trump were to ignore a Supreme Court ruling, that would cross the line. He was reflecting a familiar theme, that until President Trump thumbs his nose definitively at a court ruling, then his attacks on democracy are troubling but not lethal. It's normal politics up until that dramatic confrontation between the executive branch and the judicial branch, for which the Constitution, as we know, really has no prescribed remedy. And for many Americans, they may breathe a sigh of relief that America's most influential private sector leaders would rise up to defend democracy if this confrontation that we worry about came to pass. Combined with a massive public mobilization, we could be saved. But I didn't breathe a sigh of relief. The opposite. I'm deeply worried that we have really spent little time studying the paths that democracies take when they collapse. Most of the time, there is not a singular moment when the executive dramatically seizes power. There's not normally a brazen attempt to burn down the Parliament building. No, instead, democracies die when gradually, often quietly and methodically over time, the structures that hold the executive accountable for corruption, for thievery, for wrongdoing are dismantled. Dismantled so that citizens can no longer hold the executive accountable. Dismantled so that the political opposition never has enough room to maneuver meaningfully. There are still elections. The executive doesn't try to stuff the ballot box. Occasionally at lower levels, the opposition still wins. But what happens is that those structures of accountability are either so degraded or so completely co-opted by the regime that the truth is just buried, and the political opposition loses the basic tools that it needs to win. In every democracy that stops being a democracy, then there's a familiar story. There are 4 institutions that the regime attacks, and attacks relentlessly until those structures of accountability are so disintegrated that even though elections continue to happen, the same party or the same person wins power election after election. And those four institutions are the press, the legal profession, universities, and the business community. If you degrade or co-opt these four institutions, you never need to have a high-stakes fight with the top court in your country. You don't need to burn the Reichstag down. You can still have elections, but only one party will win. So that's why this CEO's assurance, frankly, sent a chill down my spine. Because our democracy isn't at risk of dying, it is dying. As we speak, we are watching it die. It is not too late to save it. Let me say that again. It is not too late to save our democracy, but we can't continue to close our eyes and think that our democracy can survive a coordinated assault on those four key institutions of accountability. Democrats and Republicans need to see what is happening before our eyes, rise up and defend the independence of journalists, of lawyers, of universities, and of the private sector. So I want to spend a minute or two to walk you through what President Trump is doing and how it frankly, chillingly mirrors the tactics that other leaders have used to transition real democracy into pretend fake democracy. It always starts with journalists. From Hungary to Belarus to Venezuela, countries that have elections, but elections where one party just keeps on winning, these are places where journalists are subject to nonstop harassment campaign from the regime, such that people just stop doing journalism or journalists stop telling the full truth. Last month, for instance, the Turkish president, Erdogan, locked up 11 journalists simply because they were covering protests against Erdogan's jailing of the top opposition leaders. Now, Trump has not started jailing journalists, but the pace of harassment in the first 60 days of his second term is alarming. He's denied access to government buildings, including the White House, to journalists who don't use pre-approved language from the White House. He is preferencing credentials to partisan journalists who simply parrot his party line. His FCC has begun to deliberately harass media companies that are owned by political opponents of the president. But Trump's campaign to destroy independent journalism, it has a darker and more menacing side, because Trump isn't just trying to intimidate journalists so that they'll be afraid to tell the truth. He's also trying to destroy the concept of truth itself. And again, this is a key facet of leaders who are elected who are trying to transition democracies away and into something very different. How do you destroy truth? Well, that's why the Secretary of Defense looks into the camera and tells the American public that the text messages that everybody read, filled with classified information and war plans, did not include classified information and war plans. The White House wants you to believe that 1 + 1 does not equal 2 any longer, that you should doubt even the clear things that you see with our eyes, that nothing is real, that nothing is true, that if you are a supporter of the regime and I tell you 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 +